Hello, everyone. This is Peter Coughlin, and this is a screen capture video presentation of the lecture IA-20 on industrial-based assessment. This is the lecture that was originally scheduled for me to present in Baruch, but I had a family medical emergency that kept me out last Thursday and Friday, and so I certainly appreciate everybody's understanding, and I know this is perhaps a poor substitute, but it is hopefully a viable and effective one nonetheless. So again, appreciate your patience and understanding and hope you benefit from what was intended with this lecture. So this lesson, IA-20, Industrial-Based Assessment, is actually the start of our module on national security industrial policy. And this module is actually the final module in the progression from business economics through industry analysis. And remember, we talked about the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, and we mentioned that we're going to switch to policy, right? So we're adding this structure, conduct, performance, and policy element of the course. And even though it's one module, it's actually the longest module of the course. It's a total of 6 lessons, counting sort of the integration lesson at the end. And it really is the idea of saying, now that we understand, what industry looks like from the firm's perspective, from the industry perspective, now we evaluate it from the government perspective, from the policy perspective. So what does this mean ultimately for industrial policy, which arguably is the central role of the Eisenhower School, or at least the unique, distinctive capacity or capability that we bring to the table, is to say something about industrial policy to support national security. So just to give you an idea of what the overall role of this module of the course is on industrial policy, let's go back to the very beginning of the course. We talked about structure, conduct, and performance. So you remember we talked about the structure being about the structure of industry, right? The number of suppliers, the basic supply and demand conditions, the number of buyers and sellers, etc. So all the stuff we did in business economics about the structure of industry. Then we talked about conduct of firms. So much of the course was about the conduct of firms and this idea of strategic positioning, innovation, corporate strategy, all these things that firms actually do. And then of course performance. Now performance, to this point, we've talked about performance from the firm perspective, sort of the idea of profitability or in value, sales growth, this idea of looking at performance of an industry from the firm's perspective. Now, in this last module of the course, however, we're going to talk about it from the government perspective. The idea of how what matters in terms of performance for a firm is not necessarily the same as what matters from industry or performance from the perspective of the government, right? What the government cares about in terms of an industry performance, for example, might be related to the economic issues of efficiency, but or generally this idea of technological progress or advancement. But in particular, for the role of the Eisenhower School, we're looking at the performance of industry in terms of its alignment with national security priorities. Is the industry providing what is needed to make sure that we have a robust, resilient, effective, sufficient industrial base, right? And so again, those standards of what performance means will differ from the firm perspective versus the government perspective. So that's the first thing, is that we're taking a twist on the structure, conduct, performance paradigm and looking at performance from a government perspective, in particular from a national security perspective. But we also understand what element we're talking about here. You may remember, some of you hopefully saw the diagram like this, and this idea of understanding, going back to the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. The basic idea being that structure of industry tends to drive the conduct of firms in that industry, and of course the conduct then tends to dictate performance, right? So structure ultimately impacts performance both indirectly through conduct, but also more directly, right? Industry structure in and of itself tends to dictate the performance of that industry or firms within the industry. But we also saw, of course, that there's the reverse feedback mechanism, right? Performance will impact conduct, will impact structure, right? Or firm performance might affect the overall structure of the industry. So again, this relationship among structure, conduct, performance. And you may remember we talked about this idea. We didn't talk about it much in the course since then. We said, look, but there also are these external shocks, right? Things from the outside of the structure of industry, the cognitive firms, or the performance that can impact any one of these 3 elements, right? And maybe it's some major technological change, some macroeconomic variables, things like that. But in particular, in this last part of the course, we're going to talk about the role of industrial policy, right? So this is a shock that is sort of a planned shock, right, from the government perspective, right? The idea that we have an ability as a government with our policy to impact both the structure of the industry, the conduct of firms of the industry, and the performance of that industry and those firms within, right? And so what is the role of industrial policy for impacting the structure, conduct, and performance elements of this paradigm. That is the role of this last part of the course. And we're going to do that in these 6 lessons, right? So we're going to start off with this lecture I'm giving today, intended to be obviously originally in Baruch, on industrial-based assessment. Right? And when we talk about industrial, and in particular, you'll see what I want to cover in industrial-based assessment is not about a descriptive idea, but about a prescriptive idea. I'll explain what I mean by that, about that in a second. Lesson 21, again, is about government intervention. This idea that, okay, so once we've figured out, how we assess the health or the risks in the industrial base, what can we do about it? And so we want to understand the basic economics, if you will, about government intervention. So that's going to be a seminar presentation and discussion, just to understand sort of the ideas of whether it be, when there is a role for government intervention, right? Things like externalities and public goods, when we see a viable role for government intervention, and what are the ways government intervenes and what are the impacts of those interventions generally, right? And then the heart of this module is going to be 3 case studies of examples of industrial policy, right? So lesson 22 is going to be a case study on Raphael Development Corporation, in particular the innovation system in Israel. So it'll tackle 2 issues relevant to industrial-based policy. One is defense conversion, right? This idea of the role of dual-use technologies and the ability to convert military technology to commercial use, which helps for a viable industrial base, but also the idea of national systems of innovation and how that helps foster innovation within a country, in particular Israel in that case. Then lesson 23, IA-20, is going to be a case study about solar, about shaping the future of solar power, and about the use of industrial and trade policy to sort of shape the future of solar power in a competition between U.S. and China in that regard. Lesson 24 is going to be about how countries enable national competitiveness, create the conditions for national competitiveness. And we're going to use the example of Shenzhen, right? So the Shenzhen cluster, sort of China's Silicon Valley, and what has been Chinese, sort of industrial policy. And then finally, lesson 25 is going to be sort of integrating industry analysis to your industry study, in particular a lesson that will allow us to review some of these ideas, but also apply them specifically, understand what does this mean for industrial policy within the scope of your industry study. So let's first talk about then IA-20. So today is IA-20. This lecture is about industrial-based assessment. The agenda is as follows. Now, before I talk about the specific topics, what I want you to understand is I'm intending ultimately the goal of this lecture is to be prescriptive, not descriptive. In other words, you've probably seen in your lifetime or in your time at Eisenhower sort of descriptions or read things about describing the overall defense industrial base, right? Whether it be the type of firms, the size of the revenues, the profitability, all of these sort of things broadly about the defense industrial base, the evolution over time. You had the Jacques Gansler chapter about the defense industrial base we assigned for this lesson. But my goal is to, given that I can't do everything in this lecture, is to be prescriptive. How do we actually, in other words, how do we actually assess the industrial base? As you're going forward with your industry study, right, the idea is to understand what can you use from this to contribute to your understanding of the sector within your industry study, and how do you actually apply that? So the topics we're going to cover is, first I want to define the defense industrial base. It should be an easy issue, but it actually is a complicated one. What does it mean to have a healthy industrial base? What does defense industrial strategy mean? What does it mean to have a strategy related to the defense industrial base? How we sort of figure out assess the historical, since about 2013, sort of the way that DoD has assessed the industrial base in terms of fragility and criticality. And then also some other perspective on defense industrial base assessment, in particular related to Executive Order 13806 and how that process was used. And within that, then we talk about that process identified these 5 macro forces shaping the industrial base, and then 10 risk archetypes within the industrial base. We'll talk about each of those. And finally, a little bit of the introduction to the instruments of industrial policy. So how do we actually, what are the instruments we have for engaging industrial policy? Although that last bullet is something we're going to go into more detail in the subsequent lessons, IA-21, 22, 23, 24. All right. So first, what is the defense industrial base? Now, this is something that it's a word that gets thrown around, a phrase that gets thrown around, but it is actually not always that clear. Now there's some sense in which you'll see sometimes references to the industrial base more broadly, broadly the industrial base, the economic industrial base, or something like that, right? The global industrial base, the domestic industrial base. So this broad idea of the industrial base. We also have this notion of the national security industrial base, right? In fact, that's what my business card says. I'm a professor of the national security industrial base. So we here look at the industrial base, the national security industrial base, but then there's the idea that within the national security industrial base, is there arguably a subset that we would call the defense industrial base, right? And so, again, there's some notion that there's something, the defense industrial base is probably part of the national security industrial base, which is part of the broader industrial base, right? But the reality is there's a lot of questions about the scope of what this actually means. And is this only, for example, military-specific items, right? Or is it everything that the Department of Defense buys, for example, right? Are the paper clips that are in my desk, right, part of the defense industrial base, right? Or is it just things that are military-specific? Is it just the domestic supply chain? When we say the defense industrial base, are we talking about the domestic defense industrial base? Or are we talking about the global supply chain that supplies our defense industries or our defense operations? Is it just manufacturing, right? So we talk about the manufacturing and industrial base. So is it just manufacturing, or is it, about development and sustainment as well, right? The other stages that go into, supporting the supply chain or the overall warfighter needs. Is it just about the institutions and facilities that are, the actual physical facilities and or the institutions or organizations, the firms, that are part of this, or do we talk about the people, intellectual property? Am I part of, or you as an employee, or the employees of BAE, of Northrop Grumman, are they individually part of the industrial base? Is the intellectual property part of the industrial base, right? Is it just the primary contractors? So sometimes you'll see people talk about defense industrial base and they'll talk about the big five, or the primary contractors, as if they are the entire industrial base, or is it all tiers of the supply chain, right? And finally, is it just private businesses? We talk about industrial base, we tend to think that we mean private industry, or is it include universities who might do defense-related research, for example? Or does it include public organizations, right? The government-owned operations or other public entities, right? And so again, we need a more specific understanding of this. So for my purposes, then the first thing I referred to is that I gave you this GAO report, or excerpts of it, right? So the GAO periodically does reports on the defense industrial base. So I was curious how the GAO, the General Accounting Office, or Government Accountability Office, sorry, defines the industrial base. They define it as following: the combination of people, technology, institutions, know-how, and facilities, right? So that's interesting. It's the people, includes the people and the know-how, not just the physical things, right? Used to design, develop, manufacture, and maintain, right? So not just the manufacturing portion of it, right? The weapons needed to meet U.S. national security objectives, and it encompassed three components of the acquisition lifecycle: research and development, production, and maintenance and repair. So all three elements of the acquisition lifecycle. And it includes public and private sector companies, employees, and facilities. Right? So again, it's not just the private sector. So again, it's going to include, as you can imagine, the organic industrial base. But the canonical, or if you will, the primary document I'm going to refer to as the current sort of master perspective on this is the latest, is the September 2018 report coming out of the Executive Order 13806. Right? And here's how it defines the industrial base, or defense industrial base: the end-to-end set of capabilities. Okay, interesting. Defines it as the capabilities, right? So not the physical assets or anything, but the capabilities, both private and public, that design, produce, and maintain platforms and systems on which our warfighter depends. It is a extensive, multi-tiered, right? So now we're clearly not just talking about the primary contractors, right? And global supply chain, right? So again, the defense industrial base, the American defense industrial base, if you will, or the defense industrial base in support of U.S. defense, right, is global. It's not just the domestic elements of the supply chain. So the global supply chain encompassing extraction and refinements of primary materials, manufacturing components and parts, and integration and sustainment of defense platforms and systems, right? So again, from the scope includes from the raw material to the manufacturing, sustainment, but also the design and development as well. It is a geographically and economically diverse network. So again, geographically, it's not just we're not just talking about domestic industry here, right? Private sector companies, research and development organizations, academic institutions, and government-owned facilities. So in other words, again, the academic institutions, that as long as they are contributing to the set of capabilities on which our warfighter depends, they are also part of it, and of course government-owned facilities. So it is not simply private sector businesses when we talk about the defense industrial base that develop and produce the technologies enabling U.S. military dominance and ensuring national security. So again, when you look at the industrial base within your industry study, make sure you are looking at everything from design, development, production and sustainment. You're also looking at private sector, public sector, academic, right? Every element of the triple helix, if you will, of universities, government, and industry, right? And again, being about the capabilities, whatever drives those capabilities, whether it's the facilities or the individuals or the know-how or the intellectual property. What's the horizontal scope? So in other words, some idea of what are these sectors. So here is one. This is from the GAO report. They talk about the key, and this is according, again, a GAO analysis of DoD information. So what the DoD identified as key industrial sectors within the defense industrial base, right? Aircraft, electronics, command and control communications, computers, ground vehicles, materials, munitions and missiles, radar, electronic warfare, space, shipbuilding, right? Again, we have 18 industry studies, so we've managed to have more. The right number is something that's going to come up in a second, right? But again, these are broad sectors defined by DoD, right? Note that GAO sort of looks at how many of these are defense and commercial versus those that are primarily, if not exclusively, defense, right? Munitions and missiles, radar, electronic warfare. Again, some of these are heavily dependent upon defense markets alone, or defense, applications alone. Here's another way to look at horizontal scope. Oops. Not sure what happened there. So the report in support of Executive Order 13806 sort of defined the following industrial sectors. They had several they called traditional industrial sectors: aircraft, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, ground systems, munitions and missiles, nuclear matter warheads, radar, electronic warfare, shipbuilding, soldier systems, and space. Those are traditional defense industrial sectors. But also over here on the right, these cross-cutting industrial sectors: cybersecurity for manufacturing, electronics, machine tools, and industrial controls, materials, the organic base, software engineering workforce. So again, on the right, we have these sort of sectors that would apply across all of the traditional sectors on the left, right? And so part of that research for Executive Order 13806 was to look at each one of these, both traditional and cross-cutting sectors, to analyze it for industrial-based risk, and then, of course, recommendation of what to do about it. All right, so again, that's the horizontal scope of the defense industrial base. Understand sort of the scope of the different sort of segments or sectors that we consider. We also got to think of a vertical scope, this idea of a multi-tiered supply chain. So this, again, is a diagram from that GAO report saying, look, when you think about the, some system that you're getting for the warfighter, you might have a prime contractor. And this diagram is intended to show the relative, sort of size of the different tiers, right? Then you have these subsystems, integration, and testing suppliers, then major subsystem or component suppliers, then all the raw material, parts, or equipment suppliers, right? So the idea is, even though you might have one prime contractor, you have this very deep multi-tiered supply chain that ultimately goes into, right? And the defense industrial base includes every element, every vertical element of that multi-tiered supply chain. In terms of geographic scope, it's also important to understand when we talk about defense industrial base, we are talking about the global supply chain for our warfighter capabilities, right? And this is just a diagram, one example of a diagram from a Bloomberg Businessweek article called the F-35's global supply chain, right? And you'll see, of course, a lot of what goes into it is from different parts of the United States, but you also see, of course, several elements coming from the United Kingdom. Right, you'll see the ejection sheet or the lift fan coming from the UK. You'll see the wing box comes from Italy, right? The rudders and vertical leading edges come from Norway, right? So again, we have a global supply chain. The defense industrial base includes the global supply chain for the platforms and systems that meet our warfighter needs. And it's also important, of course, just to understand, you've seen something like this, the top defense firms globally, right? And you could look at Defense News as a good source, but this is the source that I use. This is the SIPRI, Top 100 Arms Producing and Military Service Companies, right? And they haven't come out with 2018 yet, but this is as of 2017. They do a really good global analysis of all the top defense firms. Some of you are going to Sweden will actually visit SIPRI. And you'll see, of course, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, BAE, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, the ones that we know about. 5 of the top 6, obviously, in the United States, right? BAE based in the UK, although their biggest operations are actually in the United States. Airbus, Thales, Leonardo, European. And finally, Almaz-Antey, so I'm not sure how you pronounce it in the native Russian, but is the largest Russian defense firm, right? So it gives you some idea of who the top 10 firms are globally. You might be asking a question, what about China? Well, the reality is that SIPRI doesn't actually again, so the idea is, how does CIPRI handle China? Well, they don't cover them due to lack of consistent data, right? So they really can't get good consistent data. They have estimates, right? But consistent data over time of the size of these Chinese defense firms, which are, of course, publicly owned, right, are challenging. But they do estimate that 3 companies would be in the top 10 if they, based on the data they do have. AVIC, about 20 billion, so it would be roughly number 6 in the world. The Rinco, about 17 billion, would be number 8. CETC, about 9 billion. I'm sorry, 12 billion would be number 9, right? So they would have 3 that are in the top 10, and at least 7 other companies would be in the top 100, right? So Chinese arms producing companies, right? Although there's not good data about them, when you look at these lists, when they're excluded, understand that they're excluded for data reasons, not because they don't actually make the list. All right, so that's the idea of what is the defense industrial base, including some individual players, right? So what does it mean by a healthy industrial base, right? So what does it mean, as we're trying to assess it, what does it mean to, how do we know if it's healthy, and how would we measure, the health of the industrial base? Well, there's a couple, we have guidance, of course, from the Department of Defense, and so this is actually, this is from their latest, the Department of Defense's annual industrial capabilities report. And this is where they talked about sort of their ideal industry characteristics, right? And the ideal industrial base is one that's robust, right? Many diverse companies, right? Commercial firms, regularly supporting U.S. needs, right? Competitive market, efficient and effective supply chain. It's secure, right? That your supply is assured, cyber security is guaranteed, right? You're also talking about tampering and counterfeits, right? It's resilient, it's scalable, it's sustainable. So it's going to be sustainable across sort of the peaks and valleys of defense spending, but it's also scalable. It can surge, it can mobilize when needed, and it's innovative, right? It has sort of agility addressing tomorrow's threats, right? And it's an attractive market for all companies and all individuals. You're getting the good workforce as well. And again, so this deals with both the ideas of there's a continuing fostering and development of ideas within that industry base. Now, prior DoD reports talked about, so also from prior versions of the annual industrial capabilities reports, right? And I encourage you, these are available on the website. It used to be called MIBP, Manufacturing Industrial Base Policy. It's now just industrial policy, right? But you can find all the old reports going back I'm not sure how far they go back online, right? But at least 10 years of reports on their annual industrial capabilities report, right? And so they do this annual report. I encourage you to look at it. It goes through each sector. It doesn't necessarily have recommendations, but it does an assessment of the capabilities in each sector. So they talked about one of the consistent ideas is that the DoD, again, back to their ideal industry characteristics, DoD desires a defense industrial base that is reliable, cost-effective, and sufficient to meet strategic objectives. Right? But it emphasized that the capabilities are not an end in and of themselves, but a means to the DoD's ultimate objective: the development, production, and support of material necessary to provide for the nation's defense. Again, you want a defense industrial base that's reliable, cost-effective, and sufficient. Okay? Of course, what do those mean? What does reliable, cost-effective, and sufficient mean? Well, fortunately, they go on to tell us, right? What is a reliable industrial base? It is one in which the suppliers deliver contracted products and services on time, right? And count on you to be on time. That you're viable for the long term with fair operating margins, right? So we have a sense in which there's a financial security that you're going to be around, right? You have a stable or expanding business base, right? So you're not shrinking, you're not declining, not likely to exit, right? That the suppliers invest in R&D, they invest in capital equipment, they invest in workforce development, they're investing, that they have products with integrity, free of tampering or counterfeiting. So the reliability here is that you can rely on the quality of that product. And that you're facilitating innovation, not only innovating yourself, not only investing in innovation yourself, but you're facilitating innovation by your subsystem providers, right? So that both large and small, so you're giving opportunities for small players to be involved because of allowing for innovation, new or established, global or domestic, right? So again, that your industrial base is fostering, every tier of your industrial base is not only innovating itself, but it's fostering innovation at the tier below it that is supplying it. Cost effective. Not surprisingly, that you can deliver products or services at or below cost, that you have at least 2 viable innovative suppliers in mature market areas. So if they're more mature, you want to make sure there's at least 2 viable innovative suppliers in mature areas. More developing areas, where demand is high, innovation is critical, then you want to have a greater number of suppliers, right? When it's less mature of an industry, right? We talk about the industry life cycle, then you want to have even more than 2 sort of viable suppliers, right? You want to have them have not be totally dependent upon U.S. DoD contracts, right? You like them to have non-defense or dual-use markets, access to those dual-use markets. That's part of we're going to get through with the Raphael case study, the commercialization of defense technologies, but the idea of having dual-use markets, but also international markets. You want them to be able to export products overseas to a degree, right? We put limits on that, but to the extent that it makes for a viable, it allows it to lower costs. This is under the category cost-effective. That there's robust competition in sub-tiers, not just in each tier, not just the higher tiers, but at each sub-tiers, that you don't have monopolies at any one of the tiers of your suppliers. At no point down that long chain do you actually have an individual monopoly supplier, which is causing a bottleneck and/or causing high prices. And then ultimately that you have with multiple competitors and multiple firms able to provide that capability, that you mitigate the risk of cost growth due to schedule disruptions. You're not overly dependent upon, for example, one supplier at any one stage. And finally, sufficient. What does that mean to have a sufficient industrial base? It's one in which the suppliers deliver the contracted products and services that meet DoD performance requirements. It's sufficient, it meets the needs, right? But you're also flexible, right? So that you're sufficient, you can react positively and quickly to changing requirements, right? So you are able to respond to changing requirements, and you're also adaptable. This is the idea of, if you think about mobilization and surge, demonstrate adaptability of both production lines and technology, particularly during times of conflict, right? So when we need you to produce more of the same thing, you can do it. And when we need you to produce a new thing, you can do that as well, right? You can adapt to the evolving needs because of situation of conflict. All right. Again, sorry about that. Lost the presentation here. Where are we? Yes, resume slideshow. There we go. That you can effectively manage the requirement peaks and valleys, so you're sufficient to survive, the valleys and the changes we have in our defense funding, defense spending, and that you're also maintain the ability to hire, train, and retain the specialized skills, right? So that you not only are sufficient as a firm, but sufficient in terms of human capital, and finally that you have the technology or technology development programs to meet current and projected DoD needs. Projected being the most important thing, right? You're sufficient for today as well as sufficient for tomorrow. So again, the idea of health is that is reliable, cost-effective, and sufficient. So that's what the defense. Now we know what the defense industrial base is. Now we know what a healthy industrial base means. What is defense industrial strategy? So this goes back to the idea of strategy in general. Now, first of all, here's actually again from the same DoD Annual Industrial Capabilities Report. This exact quote. The industrial strategy of the Department of Defense is to rely on market forces to the maximum extent practicable to create, shape, and sustain those industrial and technological capabilities needed to provide for the nation's defense. Right? Again, the idea is to not intervene, to rely on market forces to the extent possible. Right? So the idea is that not to recommend government intervention in every element, but to the degree possible, keep your hands off, leave it alone. But the department will intervene in the marketplace only when absolutely necessary to create and/or sustain competition, innovation, and/or essential industrial capabilities. So as you are going about developing, for example, your industry study report, your individual papers, and/or your group paper, do not presume that the default should be for government to get involved. The default should be for government to stay out, right? And the idea is only when, again, quote, absolutely necessary is our industrial policy to actually intervene in the market. And so again, when you make a recommendation, you've got to explain why intervention is actually needed, why the market is not sufficient to solve that problem. And here I gave you this reading from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. I think it's very important because it relates this idea of strategy we've been doing throughout the IA. What strategy really means to the idea of industrial-based strategy, right, or industrial strategy. This quote, and the first thing is this idea, remember, of your reading from, you had several readings that talked about how many firms actually think they have a strategy when they don't, right? Well, the same can be true of DoD when it comes to industrial strategy. Quote, since the emergence of a standing military-industrial congressional complex in the 1950s, the U.S. government has shown a little inclination to develop, much less to pursue over any period of time, a coherent, long-term strategy for maintaining a healthy indigenous defense industry, right? And you're reading from Jacques Gansler, on Democracy's Arsenal, says the same thing. There really has not been a long-term, consistent defense industrial strategy. Right? We sort of an absence of a strategy. So what would a strategy mean then, if we did have one? Well, the CSBA reading talks about using, again, going back to the Richard Rumelt reading you had on the perils of bad strategy, right? The kernel of a good strategy is 1, a diagnosis of the problem, 2, a guiding policy, right? And 3, coherent actions. So what would be the guiding policy? So this is again quoting that study. A plausible guiding policy for sustaining the U.S. defense industrial base as a national asset and enduring source of advantage is, quote, ensure the preservation of those few sectors that are currently critical to American national security. What is currently critical? Adding over time any emerging sectors that become critical, and this is the most important part, ruthlessly underfunding or jettisoning any sectors that cease to be critical. What does that really mean? Well, it goes on to explain the following. Of the perhaps 2 or 3 dozen sectors into which the defense industrial base can be logically segmented, the number of strategically critical sectors cannot exceed 5 to 7. Right? You can't have that many sectors that are truly critical. They're all important, but which ones are critical? Quote, good strategy is always about choice. In this case, favoring the genuinely vital sectors of the defense industry, while more importantly, neglecting or ignoring the rest. Remember, strategy is about saying no. Strategy is about what you don't do. An industrial-based strategy that seeks to preserve every sector deemed desirable by any of the warfighting communities is not a strategy and will not succeed. Again, emphasizing that what really matters is this idea that you've got to figure out what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, right? And you may or may not agree, with this particular perspective, but it does beg the question, right? If a defense industrial strategy means saying no, which defense industrial sectors are we not going to have an active industrial policy towards? That's the question, right? And if I was delivering this in Baruch, I would tell you, look around the room. We have 18 industry studies represented here. Not all 18 of you are critical. Why are you critical and why are they not? And then let you guys fight it out in the aisles, right? But the point being that we've got to figure out that the reality is if we say we've got to preserve everything, Frederick the Great says, he who preserves everything preserves nothing, right? We do not have the resources to necessarily preserve every aspect, every sector of our defense, right? Doesn't mean we don't let the market do, but we cannot afford to intervene in every element of every defense sector, right? Again, you can disagree with that, but there's a pretty good case made in the article, so you at least should think about that and understand if this is the perspective, defend why we should have an active industrial policy in your sector for your industry study. All right, so that is the idea of a defense industrial strategy. What about industrial-based fragility and criticality? And so the idea is, one way we think about, okay, so if we can't preserve everything, what should we preserve? Well, going back to, it was developed about 2012, 2013, DoD, MIBP, Manufacturing Industrial Policy, industrial-based policy, now just industrial policy, right, has this framework, this fragility and criticality framework, right? And again, going back to, it specifically includes criticality. What is really critical for us to preserve? So what does this mean? Well, the fragility and criticality approach, sometimes called the FAC, fragility and criticality, FAC approach, is to look at to assess the industrial base or each sector of the industrial base in 2 dimensions. First, fragility, right? And fragility is sort of akin to the probability of failure, right? What are and you look at factors that make capability likely to be disrupted, right? And you assess the financial outlook of the providers. You assess how dependent they are on DoD sales, the number of firms, right, that can provide the capability. Do you have many competitors, or is a sole source? What about foreign dependency? And then also criticality, meaning, so what? What if it does fail? What is the consequence of failure, right? The risk of failure might be small, the risk of failure might be high, but the consequence small, right? Or you might have the risk of failure be small, but the consequence very high, so you're concerned. Or if both are high, right, then you're even more concerned, right? So what makes capability difficult to replace? If it's defense unique, right? It's not something you can get from the commercial market. It's defense unique. It requires specialized skills, right? Requires defense-specific knowledge requirements, right? So you can't. Part of the idea is how difficult it would be to replace it. What if it disappeared? Think about the idea as you look at your industrial base. Think about a firm, and I asked this with my students in their firm briefs. What if that firm disappeared? How hard would it be to replace what they have, right? Well, if you have defense-specific knowledge, right, then you cannot necessarily take a commercial firm and put it in place because they don't have that knowledge. What about specialized equipment or facility requirements, right? Again, if you need that specialized equipment, you need to reproduce that equipment. And then the idea, just because you can do it, how long does it take? How long does it take to reconstitute that capability? If that capability suddenly disappeared within the defense industrial base, how long would it take to reconstitute, redevelop that capability? And finally, generally speaking, the availability of alternatives. What sort of alternatives are there available? And so this is actually, so in doing this, one thing that MIBP did or does, like within DoD, is actually they do something like this. They actually have a rubric, if you will, of how they grade the industrial base or each sector according to fragility and criticality. So this is how they look at fragility. So they rate in terms of financial outlook, right? You know, is it in the, again, in top here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, the 5 being the highest risk, you know, highest concern, 1 being the best from a DoD perspective, right? Is there very low risk? Sort of this is the first question: what is the risk of the facility going out of business? Right, very low, very severe. Right, how much total sales facility are from DoD contracts? This is interesting, right? The ideal is that you're mixed. That you both sell to DoD and you don't sell to DoD, right? You have non-DoD market. You sell to a commercial market, right? Because then if you lose some DoD contracts, you still can survive, right? But you're not going to neglect DoD because they're an important buyer from you, right? But at the extreme here is if you are more than 80% defense or less than 20% defense, that's concerning because either you are heavily dependent upon the defense sector and therefore you can, if defense spending goes down, you can be hurt, or you don't really care that much about defense and therefore you're not going to be responsive to their needs. So the idea is you want to have, again, a good balance, right? How many firms are in the sector, right? How competitive is the sector, right? What's the level of foreign dependency, right? So again, you look at fragility, they rate each sector within or each industry or even component within that sector or industry on a 1 to 5 scale on fragility according to each of these different questions. And then they look at criticality, right? And again, same rating scale, 1 to 5. How critical is how, in terms of those things I just mentioned on the previous slide, you know, or 2 slides ago, defense unique, skilled labor requirement, defense design requirements, facility and equipment requirements, reconstitution time, the availability of alternatives. So looked at each of those factors rated on a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is most worrisome and 1 is the lowest level of worry. Right? And they will create these diagrams like this. So here we have fragility. Again, you would average out the answers on fragility on a scale from 1 to 5, right, or 0 to 5, I'm sorry, and criticality, right? Although I think this goes 0 to 5, but I think they rated it from 1 to 5. But anyway, then you'll sort of see as they plot out, these are different industries or different components or different parts within a sector. They plot out. And when you're in the upper right, again, that's where you're most worried, where you're high rating of criticality, high rating of fragility. That is where we are most worrisome. And then for these ones up there, you'll sort of see how they looked at, they decided based on, then use subject matter experts say, well, this one where we need to take action, that's the ones in red. You see the ones in red here, where sectors where DoD decided they really needed to take action. There was ones where they actually have already taken action, so there's ongoing mitigation. Those are the ones that are in green, right? Further analysis is needed, so that's the ones that are in blue, and things that you just sort of watch, keep an eye on. Those are the ones in yellow. So again, this is one way that DoD looks at industry sectors. And so you should consider too, looking at, based on these prior pages, how would you assess your industry sector in terms of fragility and criticality, and where would you plot it, on this diagram? All right, and so again, that is the fragility and criticality framework. You have some of your supplemental readings go into greater detail if you really want to get into it, how you do that. That's excellent, but it's one way of looking at, what are the most important, because again, remember this idea of a defense industrial strategy about choosing where we need to focus our resources. And you can see from this diagram, right, the ones that are actions required, the ones in red are the ones where, based on these 2 dimensions as well as other considerations, DoD has decided that it's going to have to focus and invest resources and attention to. That's sort of the key or critical elements of the defense industrial base. All right. So what about this about defense industrial base assessment? So besides fragility and criticality, which is a component of this process, what is the overall stepping back perspective, how we go about defense industrial base assessment? Well, there's actually a number of perspectives that are currently still, sort of standing, sort of, if you will, DoD policy. One of them, this is actually, if you're in the acquisition community, so you have the Defense Acquisition Guidebook, it actually has this flow chart or diagram or categorization of industrial base risks. So it talks about this idea of, look, how you can look at different industrial base issues. Your industrial base issue or concern could be that you're losing something in the industrial base, or that you're getting it, but it's compromised, right? It's not trusted, it's being, counterfeited, it's being compromised, you're losing intellectual property. This idea of sort of either your risk of not getting what you need, or you're getting it, but it's in a compromised way. Then within the idea of the loss, if you lose some industrial base capability, is it due to something that provider does, or is it due to regulatory or procedural barriers? Right? And you have all these ideas of whether from everything from ITAR to qualification costs that are regulatory or procedural barriers. Then the provider, it could be that the provider can't or won't do business with the DoD for various reasons. It could be financial reasons that are limiting its ability to supply DoD. It could be an undercapacity, right? It is not able to satisfy needs, right? They're not able to invest capital, right? They lack raw materials, they lack qualified labor, but otherwise it's not that they can't provide the quality you need, but maybe the quantity you need, or they just lack the ability. Either they don't have the skills, they don't have the too high of a cost to develop, maybe there's quality issues. But again, this is one way, this is one framework that's out there in your Defense Acquisition Guidebook for looking at defense industrial base assessment. So you might want to apply this again in your industry study to your particular sector. More recently, though, again, I'm using this as the canonical, sort of the current Bible. Well, it's not officially that, but the current Bible of industrial base assessment, the latest sort of comprehensive assessment, one of the most comprehensive assessments that's been done in years, was the one in support of Executive Order 13806. And so this was the approach, initially at least. This was before the report came out. This is what we were told would be done, right? And it would be identify, assess, recommend. So again, identify what are the critical sectors. Identify the key sectors, the key elements, the essential material, the raw materials and goods, and capabilities we need. Assess them, look for risks, look at resiliency, look at capacity, these sorts of things. Make recommendations. What do we do in terms of policy, legislation, regulations to sort of strengthen the defense industrial base? Now, ultimately, when the report came out in September, right, this was the framework that they talked about. They identified, and it was an iterative process, right? So they actually began looking at things, and then they developed this framework as they go. It wasn't really a step-by-step. But the idea is that they ultimately figured out that there's these broad macro forces, that are sort of the root causes that are adversely impacting the defense industrial base. And then from those root causes, they categorized these 10 risk archetypes. So these specific characteristics or factors that you see across different industry sectors that are risks within our defense industrial base. What are the impacts, right? What's actually happening? What are the effects on the industrial base sectors from that? And then finally, the recommendations, right? What do we do in terms of investment, policy, regulation, legislation? Pulling out a little bit, we actually sort of see, and we'll go through each of these, but they identified 5 macro forces, right? 10 risk archetypes, right? For impacts, they identified more than 300 individual impacts across industry sectors. Some of them broadly are sort of described in the report that I've provided to you. It's a supplemental reading of the whole report on Blackboard. But the reality is there's more than 300 or about 300 impacts. They are contained in a classified sort of appendix. They go through by sector what those impacts are, and finally, again, recommendations. So this was the approach used to look at that. So, and I encourage you as we go through, we're going to go into more detail, at least on the first 2 things. We're not going to go into the impacts so much because, as I sort of mentioned, some of those are classified, and some of those, the bigger perspective, you'll sort of understand from the macro forces and risks what those are. But let's talk about the elements here. So what about these macro forces? What are these macro forces shaping the industrial base? Well, again, they identified these 5 macro forces. So focus on the macro forces. So what do we mean by macro forces? We mean broadly as they looked at individual sectors. Remember, they looked at all those sectors, both the traditional and the cross-cutting sectors of the industrial base. As they looked at those, what were the broad root causes that were impacting and creating risk within the industrial base? Right? And so there were 5 of these. We're going to go through each one of those, each one of the 5. Right? There is this. So in the report, if you actually look at the report, and I encourage you to look at it in more detail. There's this chart here describing the basic each of the 5 macro forces. Number 1 was the sequestration and uncertainty of U.S. government spending. Number 2 is the decline of U.S. manufacturing-based capability and capacity. Number 3 was deleterious U.S. government business and procurement practices. Number 4 was industrial policies of competitor nations, so what our competitors were doing, or competitor nations were doing. And finally, diminishing U.S. STEM and trade skills. And so let me talk in a little more detail about each one of these, but I encourage you to look at the report to get even more detail on them. So here, in the next 2 slides, these are actually, if you read the report, they list the macro forces of 1 through 5, and they have A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, under each one, sort of specific elements of that. And so I'm not going to go through each one of these. Please read the report, but broadly speaking, what do we mean by these macro forces? So the first one is the idea of sequestration and uncertainty of U.S. government spending. So the idea here is that, look, we get fluctuations up and down over time, of defense spending based on the geopolitical realities, conflict realities, budget realities, economic realities, And what is the impact of that? Well, ultimately, there's several impacts. One of them is that you cannot predict. It's very hard to predict what the market's going to look like in the future, right? And so how much are you willing to invest if you do not know what the market, so the idea of these impacts of budget uncertainties is primarily talks about the idea that, look, when you do not know what your future funding is going to be, right, the future demand for what you provide is going to be, you cannot properly invest. You don't want to overinvest, so you end up having underinvestments because of uncertainty. Excuse me. And also, though, is that the result is because of underinvestment, you might not have the optimal technology, so you have these production and cost inefficiencies. What ends up happening is you end up even having excess capacity, which then tends to raise costs, right? Because of excess capacity, you built out expecting certain level of demand drops off, right? Or you underinvest, so you do not have the latest technology. These are all sort of create production and cost inefficiencies, right? And the result is that we also then, it becomes very hard for maintenance, for example, right? Because we end up having both because of budget cuts, there's less funding for maintenance, and also because the latest and greatest technology and skills aren't there because of underinvestment by industry, right? We hurt maintenance, we hurt modernization, right? We also get the fewer firms coming into the business saying, hey, I don't want to put a bunch of money to get into a business when I'm not sure what the demand is going to be, when I'll get a payoff, right? So fewer firms are coming in, and many firms are getting out of the defense segment. The second of the macro forces is the decline of U.S. manufacturing capabilities and capacity. And this talks about the idea that, look, our defense industrial base capacity is also impacted by the broader dynamics of diminishing manufacturing base broadly in the United States, right? So this is part of it is because of the gaps in the American manufacturing workforce, right? So we do not have the sort of manufacturing skills or expertise that you'd want to have in your manufacturing workforce, because in other words, as for example, a steel industry or other manufacturing industry declines, right? This, whether it's be a welder or some other skill that you might want to be involved in, say, shipbuilding, right? Because there are not complementary industries. So as the broader manufacturing base, goes away, as we have fewer manufacturing jobs in the United States, we have a diminished manufacturing workforce. Right? We've also tend to have this decoupling of design and manufacturing. The United States still tends to lead the world in many sectors in the design of products, but we tend to design them and then sell them, but they don't actually manufacture them. Manufacturing has been outsourced, right? And so this creates, once you decouple design and manufacturing, it may create efficiencies at the individual level, but it reduces coordination between design and manufacturing, which can impact innovation. Along with the decline in manufacturing has been the decline in the production and extraction of strategic and critical materials to support such manufacturing, right? We're not manufacturing domestically. We're not producing the materials for manufacturing. And so again, that has been a loss. So not only the manufacturing, but the materials for that manufacturing. More risk of counterfeits and infiltration, right? The idea is if things are being manufactured abroad, we have less monitoring. There's more danger of counterfeits or general, a compromise of our supply chain. There's a diminishing technical innovation ecosystem. Again, manufacturing is part of it. Think about Ford's innovation. They developed the Model T and the Ford production system simultaneously. So in other words, not just designing the product, but manufacturing it. You learn what the optimal design is because you're also doing the manufacturing and vice versa. There's a compatibility or complementarity across design and manufacturing, but that element of the ecosystem is lost when the manufacturing capability disappears. Reduce competition. Obviously, as you decline U.S. manufacturing capabilities, you have fewer firms doing what we need them to do in the defense industrial base. So we have less competition, which again has a cost effectiveness implication, and as well as a risk of supply chain risk in terms of reliability. So that's 1 and 2. Number 3, the third macro force is deleterious. Hard word to say. Deleterious government business and procurement practices. Basically saying, the way we procure things makes it very hard for our defense industrial base. Whether it be the procurement complexity and lengthy contract timelines, right? People just don't even want to get the contract to begin with, right? To get the procurement deal, only a few firms have the expertise, the patience, the knowledge to do that, right? The notion of bespoke accounting standards, and yes, I had to make sure I knew what bespoke means, right? Bespoke means very particular, specific, right? The idea that if you account for your accounting that you do as a defense contractor is different than your accounting you would do differently, right? Even Boeing does different operations depending upon whether they're selling to DoD versus selling commercially to to Southwest Airlines, right? Again, because they particular accounting standards or security clearance processes, right? Again, these hurdles that we make it very difficult to sell to DoD. Lengthy acquisition and development timelines, right? It takes even if you have the patience to get through the procurement process, now you got to get through the production process, which takes even longer, the development process. And oh, by the way, this is the big thing, is that by the time you get to actually develop your product, the technologies on which your product was designed, become obsolete, right? So if it takes you 15 years, to ultimately develop this platform, right? It was designed for, say, a microchip, a semiconductor that was cutting edge 15 years ago, but now is, almost obsolete, right? So again, there's that issues because of the development timelines. And lastly, I hear this a lot talking to players in the industrial base. We tend to say, give them requirements. We want this requirement as opposed to solutions. We say we want this capability, maybe, but we don't say we want to solve this problem. And so we stifle innovation in the industrial base because we tell them we want, I've always said, look, when a customer comes into a hardware store and buys a drill, they don't really want a drill, they want a hole. And the drill is the means to the end, right? So if you go to them and say, hey, I want a drill, they'll give you a drill. But if you say you want a hole, they might give you some revolutionary way to get that drill instead, right? But if we go to our defense industrial base and say we want a new version of the old thing, they will give us a new version of the old thing instead of a new thing, right? Which may solve our problem, maybe a solution. And so the nature of our acquisition process tends to stifle some innovation. Macro force number 4 is the industrial policy of competitor nations, right? In other words, what they're doing. Right? And so the basic ideas are, first of all, there is a challenging economic playing field. What does that mean? What that means is that, one, right, we do not have the cheapest workforce. Other countries have cheaper workforces. It becomes difficult for us to be competitive in labor-intensive industries because of the cheaper workforce of other countries. But 2, right, they don't always play fair, right? In terms of subsidies and tax incentives and tariffs, other things that make it difficult. We can't compete, sort of on a level playing field with competitor nations in some case, right? And then, of course, you'll see bullet points 4, B, C, D, and E are all about China. China, right? And several dimensions of competing with China. First, China's military expansion and modernization. China is funding its military, so naturally it is developing its own defense and military industrial base that is very strong. So its specific focus on military expansion has expanded its own military and defense industrial base. Also, C, China's strategy of economic aggression. Broadly speaking, it is also, when it competes economically, and we'll see examples of this in our case studies, right? They are very aggressive, whether it be, forced technology transfer, intellectual property issues, it be tariffs, other non-tariff barriers. But it basically, they don't, again, China in particular is very aggressive in their economic policies. China's soft power projection. What does this mean? It is not just about what it does to support its domestic industries, but how it uses economic leverage on the global stage, right? A country like Australia, for example, or many of the Australasian countries are far more dependent upon what they get from China than China is dependent upon them, right? And that gives China leverage, economic leverage, over its regional neighbors, right? Also, China's R&D development spending strategy. And I encourage you to look at the diagram in the study about the incredible growth in their focus on R&D. And it's not just general R&D, it's targeted R&D. They're very good about saying, we want to focus on these specific technologies and these specific industries and really win those industries, right? A very strategic approach to R&D investment, right? And finally, this idea of strategic materials, we talked a little bit about that before. And also, they specifically mentioned printed circuit boards, right? Almost as an example here of, look, 90% of all PCBs, all printed circuit boards are now done in Asia. About half of those are done in China, right? And that is an example of the result of the industrial policies of those Asian and particularly of China that have basically taken that industry completely away from the United States. And finally, the last macro force shaping the industrial base is diminishing U.S. STEM and trade skills. Again, for those who, I'm sure you know, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math sort of skills, but also trade skills, right? It's not just about getting bachelor's degrees in STEM or even PhDs or anything like that. It's even getting associate's degrees or any sort of basic trade skills. And the report talks about the demographic challenge, right? This idea that what's happening is that there's this gap with the baby boomers who did a lot of manufacturing and technical trades, right? And then the group after the baby boomers is relatively small. And so they're not, the baby boomers, as they're retiring, aren't able to pass their skills, their manufacturing skills and knowledge and their trade knowledge onto a population group that is actually invested in manufacturing, because there are just fewer of them. We have this valley, a demographic valley by age in the manufacturing workforce, between the ages of 30 and 45 or something like that. And the growing cultural bias and strategic rivals. This idea that, first, cultural bias, this idea that somehow if you ask kids these days, do you want to grow up to do trade or be manufacturing, it has become less and less popular, right? The cultural bias against going into manufacturing, right? Yet our strategic rivals have no shame about that, right? They'll focus on manufacturing, focus on STEM, right? The idea is, again, it's not just that we are investing less in these or focusing less, or our society is focused less, but our strategic rivals are focusing more on those STEM and trade skills. So again, what I encourage you to think about, in your industry studies, of these 5 macro forces, which do you think are significantly affecting your particular industry study sector? Right? So then what about the risk archetypes? So if those are the macro forces, how do those macro forces manifest themselves in particular risks within the industrial base? So the study, so first of all, because the GAO report that I gave you as a essential reading, right? They talk about these different industrial base risks. They talk about things like obsolete items, financial viability of suppliers, the fact you have only one available supplier, you have limited production capacity, or facility damaged by disaster, the loss of skill or equipment, or foreign dependence, right? All of these, though, are actually picked up in the EO 13806 report, except for the damage by disaster. But that said, the damage by disaster is only a concern when you've only got a few facilities. So it's really a single source or sole source issue there. But so just be aware of this GAO analysis of the industrial base risks. But again, the most recent comprehensive analysis of the defense industrial base is the EO 13806 report, and they identified 10 risk archetypes. So these are the ones you should be looking at when you're looking at your industry study and the sector of industry. If you want to assess its health and identify what the risks are that have to be cured, right? Try to see where each of these, to what degree these 10 risk archetypes are present within your sector. So what are they, right? So the first risk archetype is sole source. The idea that you only have one supplier able to provide the required capability. There's literally only one firm, right, or supplier that is able to provide that. You have a single point of failure because you only have one firm, one organization, because it could be a part of the organic industrial base, right, that is able to provide that capability. There's only one provider of that capability. Single source is different. It's only one supplier is qualified to provide the required capability. So a single source, so a sole source is also a single source. But the single source, the idea there is that you could have other suppliers, but there's only one that's currently qualified. So it would take time, effort, and investment to get another qualified supplier, right? They might be able to do it, but they're not yet qualified, right? Whereas sole sources, there literally is only one that's even able, right? And then next two risk archetypes are fragile supplier and fragile market, right? So fragile supplier is for a specific supplier is financially challenged or distressed, right? They are likely to go out of business. They're not doing so well. They have so high solvency risk, high liquidity risk, right? These sorts of things cause that individual supplier to be a problem. And a fragile market was where the overall economics of the industry are structurally poor, right? This is when the 5 forces for that industry say it ain't good, right? That in particularly domestically, right, that it's likely to face extinction because it's just not an attractive industry, and it's the profitability of that domestic market is eroding. So again, fragile supplier is about an individual firm. Fragile market is about the overall industry. Capacity constrained supply market, right? The idea is that there's capacity is unavailable to in required quantities or time due to competing market demands. This could be that your suppliers simply do not have the capacity to meet defense needs, or it could be that they have the capacity, but they're choosing to allocate that capacity to other buyers. In particular, it could be the commercial market, right? If they're more beholden to that's why we don't want necessarily a supplier that is 90% commercial, only 10% defense, because then when they get capacity constrained, might want to say, you know what, we're going to meet our commercial market needs. That's more important to us than our defense needs, right? And so you don't want the other way around either, right? But the idea is that you want to make sure that there's adequate capacity to meet defense needs. Foreign dependencies. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th risk archetype. It's foreign dependency, right? And the idea is that the domestic industry does not produce the product or does not produce it in sufficient quantities, right? So again, we're getting sufficient. This does not have to be at the prime contractor level, but at the sub tier, some lower subcontractor level, some lower tier, that we are heavily dependent upon foreign sources of supply. Number 7 is the diminishing manufacturing sources and materials shortage, DMSMS. It's so long they got to give it an acronym, right? And this is the idea of that there's a product or material obsolescence resulting from decline in relevant suppliers. What that really means is that you end up with a lot of defense platforms, right, depend upon obsolete technologies, right? When I took over leadership of the electronics industry study last year, I was very surprised, again, not being this is my new to this sort of issue, of the fact that there was, you know, we had these firms that were they specialize in obsolete electronics, right? So you might think this idea that, of course, we care about the cutting edge electronics, but the reality is most defense systems, partly because of the long life cycle as well as the long development times of these systems or platforms, rely on technologies that tend to be obsolete, right? And you end up having a lack of sources for the key inputs you need for your platforms, right? And so that is the idea of the DMSMS, right? Is that you ultimately have few sources for key inputs or materials that you need for your platform or system. Risk archetype number 8 is the gap in US-based human capital. And again, this is all about the workforce, right? That either your industry is unable to hire or retain US workers with necessary skill sets, right? The idea is that we do not have, we talk about the STEM skills, right? They don't have the STEM skills, the trade skills, right? Or the people we are training are primarily foreign citizens. We don't have enough, we talk about, especially at the PhD level, right? You will see, I always make the point that, I got my PhD in economics. It's not too technical, yet even in economics, right, literally half of the students in my PhD program were either Russian or Chinese, right? So they were not going to go working for Northrop Grumman in a classified program, right? So again, it could be that we're developing it in the US system, but they're not, US workers that were able to provide for the defense industrial base. It could be erosion of the US-based infrastructure. This is really focused on this idea of the loss of specialized capital equipment needed to integrate, manufacture, or maintain capabilities. The idea that you actually, infrastructure, the physical capital we need to produce the things that we need as a military are eroding. If you read the report, it talks a lot about the organic industrial base, that we haven't invested enough in the organic industrial base, and that we're getting, either the equipment needs to be refurbished, needs to be updated, needs to be expanded, right? But the idea is the capital equipment is being lost or eroded. And finally, product security, right? The lack of cyber and physical protection results in eroding integrity, confidence, and competitive advantage, right? So the idea is that we do not have, visibility maybe on what's being put into our systems or into our subcomponents, right? There could be counterfeiting, there could be, sort of interruption of our supply chain, but also cybersecurity, right? Sort of actual cyber attacks or the general loss of security, either the physical security or the cyber security, the security of the intellectual property, right? Because of a lack of a secure infrastructure. All right. So again, those are the 10 risk archetypes that are identified in the report for EO 13806. And so I, again, strongly encourage you in your industry study to think about, okay, which of these archetypes do we find present in the firms and industries that we analyze as we go, because you're ultimately going to be asked to make recommendations, but you cannot make recommendations without first making a diagnosis. So therefore, you've got to make a diagnosis. What is the problem? What are the risks within the industrial base, within the sector of your industry study? All right, and so here, for example, the report actually looks at some ideas. So these are according to the 10 different risk archetypes, the idea of which ones were most frequently observed. Remember, they looked at those number of traditional industry sectors as well as the cross-cutting industry sectors, right? And of all of those, what was the occurrence? You sort of see things like foreign dependency and erosion of U.S.-based infrastructure were the most prominent. But all of them, it wasn't a huge fragile supplier was the least common. But still, it wasn't like we go from 1 to 15 or 1 to 20. The reality is that each of these threats, each of these archetypes, was present in significant degree across the defense industrial base. All right. So lastly, just a little bit on the instruments of industrial policy. I'm not going to talk about it too much because this is actually what we're going to cover in lessons 21, 22, 23, and 24 going forward. But it's important for you to understand First of all, notice that I'm not really talking about the impacts here. You certainly can I've already hinted at the impacts of the different risks, why they cause a problem in the industrial base. But again, as you mentioned, there's a classified appendix to the report that talks about all the impacts by sector. But notice when we talk about sort of instruments of industrial policy, what about the recommendations, right? And we actually, as government, have a number of tools, right? Investment, policy, regulation, legislation, right? But I think it's important to understand that the reasons we have a number of instruments or tools or levers to impact the defense industrial base is because of the relationship between government and the defense industrial base, right? And so that's why I gave you this chapter or this introduction to read, and somewhere on Blackboard, is every single chapter from this book called The Defense Industrial Triptych. It's spelled DEFENCE because it's, of course, by British authors, right? But this idea of the most valuable thing from that reading is understanding that we think about our defense industrial base. How does government relate to the defense industrial base? Well, the obvious way, of course, is as a customer, right? We buy defense platforms and systems from the defense industrial base, right, in services, et cetera, right? So we are a customer. And so as you're learning in your acquisition and A&I course, how we acquire from the defense industrial base helps shape the defense industrial base, right? How our acquisition policies have an impact on the structure and risk and health of the defense industrial base. But we also, right, are a sponsor. We'll talk about a lot, for example, about in IA-21, as well as 22, 23, 24, about the role of government as sponsoring, whether it be funding research, sort of offering incentives, right? Creating the infrastructure and other conditions for success and competitiveness of the industrial base. But government has a role in supporting the defense industrial base. We're both supporting it and then buying from it, right? But lastly, we are also the regulator. Government is the regulator of defense, the defense industrial base. So the defense industrial triptych means that when you think about recommendations for what we should do in terms of industrial policy for your industry study, remember to think of it in terms of all three of these dimensions. All three dimensions in which government relates to defense industry. Right. And so I'm not going to talk much more because you will, again, in the following next 4 lessons, we'll talk about specific instruments and we'll see in the case studies how those played out. So that's it. That's it for this. So what have we done? We defined the defense industrial base. We talked about what makes a healthy industrial base. We talked about defense industrial strategy, right? The reality is that you cannot preserve everything. You got to preserve the most critical assets. The idea of that, how we actually assess criticality, what is critical, and whether it's fragile, whether actually it's in need of any of our concern. The process of defense industrial base assessment, focusing specifically on the framework that was used in response to the Executive Order 13806. Then the macro forces identified in that report. The risk archetypes in the industrial base identified in the report. And finally, the instruments of industrial policy. So again, I apologize that because of the family medical emergency, I was not able to be here last Thursday. But hopefully this video screen capture presentation has some of the impact. And at the very least, you can watch it on your own time and wearing your pajamas if you deem appropriate. All right, thank you.